We're going to open up the French newspapers now here on France 5. Florence with me here in the studio. Starting with the story, French newspapers continue to cover the investigation into the 2009 Air France Rio crash. Now, just get this right, Friday the investigation seemed to show that there was a lack of training, wasn't there, for the pilots, but now it seems to be more complicated.
That's right, the story is more complicated, and more importantly, it turns out that elements of the report on the investigation were actually incomplete. Things were left out. Now, this is a scoop for the business paper La Tribune, which says that according to its sources, several elements were taken out of this latest report, including elements regarding a malfunctioning stall alarm. Now, as you were saying, Friday, the Accident Investigation Agency, the BEA, published its third report, which revealed that there was chaos in the cockpit at the time of the crash, and facing sounding alarms and blinking lights. It says that the cockpit crew was confused and made the wrong maneuver. Basically, they pulled the plane up, which was not the move that they should have done to give the plane lift. No, so this led to the criticism of the quality of Air France's pilots and led to finger pointing at their training. But as the La Tribune points out, there were also problems regarding the stall alarms. Now, they said that multiple stops and reactivations of the stall alarms probably added to the confusion and disturbed the diagnosis of the pilot. And it said that, for instance, at one point, according to cockpit recordings, an alarm sound went off, and the pilot said, what's that sound? So according to La Tribune, this could help explain why the pilot made contradictory assessments of the situation and made the wrong decision.
It certainly sounds like it makes it more complicated anyway, doesn't it? And Le Parisien, they're also picking up on the same story.
That's right. Now, Le Parisien says that a lot of people are angry that this part was left out of the report, including some people within the investigation agency who have threatened to quit. And they're wondering, why was this part left out of the latest report? Because according to them, this equipment failure, because of this equipment failure, the pilots had a lot of information that was denied to them that could help them deal with this situation. Now, this obviously adds a lot of controversy to this Air France Flight 447.
Now, we are in France, land of strikes, of course. That's what the tradition is, but you've got a slightly different one to tell us about.
This is quite an unusual strike. It's on the cover of Libération. Le SAMU social ne répond plus. So, Le SAMU social is basically emergency aid services for homeless people. Basically, yesterday, they took place in a one-day strike across the country to campaign for more government help for homeless people. Now, according to the SAMU social, they are overstretched and they're actually having to turn people back. They say that their shelters are full and that the state has cut back its funding on hotel accommodation. Now, last month, the SAMU social's president, Xavier Emmanueli, who founded the group in 1993, resigned, protesting against the lack of means available for the group. Now, L'Humanité, the communist paper, is also picking up on this. They say that emergency aid workers are fed up. Ras-le-bol, that's a word you hear a lot in France regarding strikes. And it gives first-hand accounts of social workers who say that they run into families in the streets who are sleeping in their cars because the only accommodation that's available for them is very far away from where they work, so they'd rather sleep in their cars than in these accommodations. They say there are not enough houses, that the government has abandoned those in need, and that the government plans on cutting more budget cuts by the end of the year. According to the article, 4,500 emergency housing units are going to get the axe by the end of the year.
Okay, and finally, you're going to give us something a little bit more cheerful to do with France. Figaro takes us on a scenic trip.
Yes, this is somewhat of a summer special for Le Figaro. They're helping French people rediscover mythical French seasides. And today it focuses on Saint-Tropez, which is the beautiful town known for its famous jet-setting, wealthy summertime guests and sharks, according to Le Parisien. Now, this could be straight out of a movie. A wind of panic, it says, is blowing over Saint-Tropez. A 2-meter shark was spotted several times, but only by one person, one diver who came nose to nose with the creature. And so it's unclear who was more scared, the diver or the shark, but it make you think twice about taking a dip.
All right, and I bet that isn't the real shark in that picture. All right, Florence, thank you very much. That's the French newspapers here on France 5. Do stay with us. Might be, I suppose. Wow.
In Burundi, the number of farmers is on the rise, and there is less and less land to share. With its growing population, land is increasingly sought after, creating conflicts between neighbours. Now those who had fled previous ethnic clashes have returned, and more often than not, their land has changed hands. All of these disputes are undermining the country's recent national reconciliation. Reporters, Thursday 9:45 p.m. Paris time on France 24.
Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm Annette Young. Bruised and battered is how some analysts are describing US President Barack Obama after the House of Representatives finally signed off on a deal that for the first time prevented America from defaulting. But the ramifications of this last-minute agreement are not only going to be felt in Washington and across the United States, but also elsewhere in the world. Joining me now from New York is Nicholas Dungan, a senior fellow at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. Nicholas Dungan, thank you so much for joining us. To begin with, how does America look in the eyes of the world in the wake of this debate?
Well, I think the first thing to realize about this debate is that it wasn't necessary in order to lift the debt ceiling. Many times in the past, the debt ceiling has simply sailed through the Congress, and so essentially there was a political decision made, including by some of the Tea Party members, that they wanted to provoke this debate. And there are two levels to that. One is the Washington level, which is political, and in fact, I think what's happened is that the 2012 presidential campaign has started. And the other is the wider world. And the wider world includes America, and it includes, in other words, the rest of America beyond Washington, and it also includes the wider world beyond America. So in answer to your question, I think what has happened is that this debate, because it's brought together so many issues, and it's forced Americans and others to look at the problems of the United States over a period of time. In fact, what's happened is that it has exposed some systemic weaknesses in the American system, political, economic, financial. You know, we had on the very same day, at the end of last week, when we were struggling to get some resolution in this, of this in Congress, we also had employment figures come out that showed, growth figures come out that showed that the United States was growing at less than 1% per annum in the first half of this year. So the effect of this debate, I think, in the U.S. more broadly than Washington and around the world, has actually been to unearth, expose some problems that had previously been at least hidden, or maybe that can was being kicked down the road.
And Nicholas, let me just explore that point a little bit further. I mean, this is what many have said, that this deal does not address Washington's underlying fiscal problems. In fact, Le Monde here in France had a headline which described it as fragile, modest and temporary. And is it, as you just say, a case of just kicking the can down the road that bit further?
Yes, and the fact is that this deal doesn't solve anything. What it does, however, is for the first time, it means that both sides of the Capitol, the House of Representatives and the Senate, both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, the Capitol, in other words, the legislative branch, and the White House, the executive branch, have recognized that we are in big trouble. We have a series of interlocking problems that can't be solved just by getting up every morning and having every day be a new dawn and doing the best one can. We actually have to think over the long term about systemic issues. And those systemic issues are both within the political system. I mean, one of the things that we've seen in the last few weeks is what happens when you have not only divided government, but in the United States, we have a policy-making parliament. In most countries, most advanced countries, certainly in Western Europe, the government writes the laws, Parliament amends the laws, and Parliament votes the laws. But here the laws get made in Parliament. Now we're going to have a small team of people from Congress who basically are going to be making recommendations for the whole Congress between now and the end of the year. And the level of focus on them in terms of lobbying and issue management is going to be pretty heavy. So I think that's right, and I think that the can has been kicked down the road. But what they've said is we are now very serious about doing something about this very soon. And that's something new.
Nicholas, much has been made of President Obama's response to this debt crisis. Was he weak, as many Liberal Democrats say he is, or is he simply just appealing to the centre, given the upcoming presidential elections?
Well, I think that's a very astute question, because I think that what Barack Obama has had to do in recent weeks is make choices about the different roles that he has to play. And I think we have to look at that on the one side in government and on the other side in politics, as you suggest. In government, he is head of state, so he's been tempted to play the part of the arbiter above the parties, which is, for example, what President Sarkozy has said he intends to do between now and the elections in France in 2012. But he's also head of government, so he can't be an arbiter completely above the parties, and he's also head of party. So government and politics are complicated by this multiplicity of roles that the president has to play. And on the one hand, he's tried to represent his base. He's tried to represent the Democrats in Congress. He's also tried to represent his beliefs. On the other hand, in terms of methodology, he's tried to take an approach which I think he's more comfortable with, which is looking for a consensus on problems that any reasonable person should recognize need to be addressed. But the issue is that in Washington, everybody wants to address those problems from his own perspective. And consequently, what some are saying, and not just Liberal Democrats, is that Obama should have taken a much tougher line right in the beginning and said, here's the line in the sand, this is what I'm expecting you people to do, it has to be done, and applied genuine, strong political pressure to them to get that done, and not to come up to this kind of default deadline.
Now, Nicholas, you've argued that this, in fact, should be an opportunity for all sectors of American society to address what are very serious long-term issues. But if anything, this debate has revealed extraordinarily deep divisions. Can those divisions be overcome?
Well, I think the first thing that has to be overcome is the denial that there are long-term structural problems. Let's just think about what some of those are and how they've been highlighted in the last year or two. First of all, we have an economy that is not creating jobs. And beyond the 9% unemployment rate is a 16% underemployment rate, which means that 1 in 6 Americans who wants work can't find it. That's new. So we have a structurally high unemployment rate, and we have people have now begun to realize that the sort of financial economy, the boom economy, part of which was a bubble, was creating those jobs, for example, in the construction sector, and that those jobs simply aren't coming back. So when is the economy going to be able to begin to grow again, both in terms of job creations, and in the meantime, the American consumer, who was on a debt-fueled shopping spree for a generation, has put his wallet back in his pocket because it doesn't have enough money in it. So those are the economic questions that need to be addressed, and then you get to the government response to that. And what we've seen, as you suggest, is a government response where some say, well, we must cut government spending because we're on the verge of default, we've been borrowing too much, that's irresponsible. And others who say, well, we need to continue the stimulus. So the fact is that this package, in fact, provides for cuts in future years, but nothing happens this year, and very little happens next year. So it's an attempt at compromise that I think what's actually happened is not that the problems have been addressed, but that for the first time, the problems have been recognized.
So in your opinion, that's the first step in a long-term plan, and we're about to see the age of austerity begin. But while the politicians dilly-dallied over what needed to be done, the country's image abroad took a battering, didn't it?
It had to happen sometime, and I think it's a good thing, because it may take a battering, but what's actually taking a battering, as you suggest, is the image. It's what people imagine. If one has been in the United States for the last 3, 4, or 5 years, one has had an opportunity to see that Americans, for the first time, are recognizing that some of the assumptions that they've made over the last 200 years may not apply to the 21st century, that resources are always abundant, that you solve problems by fighting it out with your enemy, that individualism, works better than trying to serve the collective interest. The other curious thing in this country is that traditionally the Democrats were the party of ideas and the Republicans were the party of principles. And now one has to question, where are the principles and where are the ideas? And the consequence is that if America's image abroad has, quote, taken a battering, it's also that people have become, I think, around the world, as Americans themselves are becoming more realistic about the genuine nature of these problems. So Americans are a people like any other. America is a country like any other. And I think there's a vastly greater willingness now, indeed perhaps in Washington, and eagerness at think tanks, in Congress and elsewhere, to learn from the examples of other countries, because there's a recognition that there are some things that other countries do better.
Nicholas Duncan, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. That's it for this edition of the France 24 interview. Stay tuned for more news and headlines, which are coming up shortly.